Hi, and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week, in recognition of Time to Talk Day, we're talking about those three little words, I am fine. Often we don't mean it. So what should we be asking colleagues to really find out how they're doing? How can leaders and organisations align their actions to values that state that they truly care about how their people are showing up? Come and have a listen to Being Fine with Not Being Fine.
Today, we're going to be talking about the statement or the response that many of us are probably quite used to using of, I'm fine. And why we decided to go with this topic on this day, this week, is that we are coming up to Time to Think Day on the 1st of February. And I was reminded of a poster that they had as part of their campaign a few years ago, which talked about the statement, the response, I'm fine. And what their research, or what researchers said, is that when people are asked, how are you? 78% of us would say fine, without giving it a second thought, without thinking about whether we really were or whether we really weren't, but that our stock answer is I'm fine. And so Bridget and I are quite keen to be having a chat to explore why that happens. Why is it that we are so used to just saying I'm fine? And one of the things that the Time to Think campaign talked about is that if you are responded to with I'm fine, ask that person again. Ask them twice, ask them 3 times. Are you sure? Let me know if there's anything that you want to talk about. Tell them something about that you're going through, which may well help them open up. There's so much more that we can actually say, but that's going to be the premise of what today's conversation is about. So Bridget, I'm fine.
I'm a little bit tired and I've got a cold. Generally, things are going okay, but obviously there are things that trouble me. I think if you'd asked me that question a couple of months ago, I would have just said exactly the same. I'm fine. It's a stock response, isn't it? I went on an amazing training funded by Erasmus, actually, recently, where I don't think I've ever been on a training where we spent so much time focusing on the well-being, our well-being, putting ourselves first, that oxygen mask on first as a leader or a facilitator. And we divided into groups and every morning had a check-in. And it was really alien to me and quite uncomfortable, I have to say, at the beginning. But watching the facilitators model the behavior of saying, actually, I slept really badly last night. I'm feeling, my body's aching a little bit, and I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of work we're doing. It was really interesting to watch as the group finally, gradually, after a couple of days, started to feel comfortable about actually sharing how they truly felt and whether or not they were being challenged by some of the work that we were doing, or whether they'd felt impacted by something someone had said, whether for good or for bad. So it was a real lesson to me, because I have always been one of those people who's just like, I don't share how I'm feeling because it's vulnerable and it makes you feel weak, or we perceive it as weakness.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Because in a similar way to, I've been thinking about why I often say I'm fine. I don't do it so much now. I think more so in the last 10, 15 years ago, I'm more likely to say how I'm feeling. I'm also minded. I remember, when you'd say to that person, oh, for God's sake, don't ask them how they are, because you'll be there for ages. I think about those people now and think, well done, you.
Yeah.
Because actually, we knew how they really were. Whilst I was armour-plated saying I'm fine, and then being quite angry with the world when I really bloody wasn't.
Isn't that interesting in terms of that often we already know that people aren't fine?
Yeah.
So it's like, don't ask them because they're going to tell you all about their stuff. And
Yes.
we already know that they're not fine, but we deflect it or we ignore it. I've been guilty of that too. I know that, I think we talked about this before, where we said that we don't like behaviors, or we're triggered by behaviors in people where we know they're doing something that we can't. And so if we felt that we're unable to, or generally people feel they're unable to set exactly how they feel,
Yeah.
when someone actually does, people are like, oh God, they are always so open and honest and over emotional.
Yeah, and I'm with you, because that whole feeling about they're actually probably your mirror, that they are saying all the things about themselves that you wish, without even realizing it, that you could say about yourself. Not necessarily the
Yeah.
same things, but that you could be that open about how you're really feeling. But because we're living with it being perceived as a weakness or whatever else there's going on there. So the other piece for me, and this comes out a lot with some of the somatic coaching that I do, that often the things that shape us have happened very early on in life. And I probably have said that already on another episode, but it's worth conveying again, because I know that from a childhood perspective, emotions weren't to be shown. Big girls don't cry. Emotions are weakness, that you need to be self-reliant. You don't need to be what was perceived as burdening other people with how you're feeling. You've got to be able to just crack on with it. Nice big element of man up when I'm not a man.
But also, let's be clear, telling men to man up
Exactly.
is
It's the most
such
ridiculous
a
thing.
harmful archetype. When
Really
we think about
harmful.
the suicide rates of young men,
Yes.
telling them that they can't share their emotions, or that, it's not for men, is just such a harmful thing that needs to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when you say that, it reminds me of the company I was working with when Time to Think did this campaign with the I'm Fine posters. The chap that was working for me, who was dealing with the campaign, and he was part and parcel of my organizational development and wellbeing strategy, and promoting all of that, was probably the world's worst. You know who you are. I'm not going to tell you your name, but I might just let you know that this is going on in this episode. But was the world's worst at saying, I'm fine. And of course, these posters came out. And whilst we made a bit of a joke about it, with me saying to him every time he said it, are you sure? He realised quite what was happening for him. And so it did actually open things up a bit for why he would always say, I'm fine. And as I say, so I'm with you. This isn't just about manning up being said to me. It is absolutely a terrible thing to say to anybody if that's not how they're feeling. And that's what we need to get past.
When I was doing some research for this episode, I came across this really interesting study by Deloitte. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm never entirely sure whether someone's going to be sitting there spitting their tea out as they're like, no, it's Deloitte. Anyway, Deloitte did
Deloitte.
I don't know, is it French? Anyway, they did a study. They've got a research group into all kinds of elements, and they did a 2021 study into leadership, into senior leadership, their well-being and resilience. And obviously this has come massively to the fore as a result of the pandemic. And when they were looking at this post-pandemic sort of stress levels, they found that 82% of senior leaders in organizations were reporting exhaustion, and 50% were contemplating resignation, leave of absence, or working part-time. And they sort of went through 1,200 leaders in 11 companies, probably mainly in America, I guess. But, even though the American work ethic is like different to the rest of Europe or the world, that I'm sure that there is an extrapolation here. But one of the big things that came out of that was that many leaders, despite the fact that it's really well known that leaders do need to focus on their own well-being first in order to then be able to focus on the well-being of their teams, doesn't work the other way around, is that they often felt unable to help. And they looked into some of the reasons why that was. And yeah, it's a really, really interesting study. I'll attach the link, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that they came out with. And I'd be interested to hear maybe,
Yeah.
if you've been involved in well-being sort of programs in organizations, sort of what your take on it was, because some of the conclusions from this study were really far-reaching. I was kind of like, wow, this is, aspirational, but if companies manage to do this, it's really impressive.
I'd definitely like to hear more. I mean, I can say a little bit about some of the wellbeing pieces that I've done in the past, because I'll say up front now, I am no mental health expert in any way, shape or form. I'm very committed to mental health. And one of the things I often say is that everybody has it. It's just that some people's are healthier than others. One of the reasons that this is some years back now that I ended up being that much more involved in it and seeing it as part and parcel of the wellbeing piece within an organisation actually came from the fact that we couldn't collect EDI data in this organisation. Because of a culture where there had previously been quite a lack of trust. So I was trying to find something that was wholly inclusive. All of those things should be wholly inclusive, but what could be a way in? So we took the pledge around mental health and well-being and started down that path with people and opening up all sorts of different spaces or different ways of being able to have those conversations. And as a result, when we eventually signed the pledge, I asked the chief exec.
It makes you sound like you're signing up for giving up alcohol. I signed the pledge.
Signed the pledge. I asked the chief exec if he would come as part and parcel of the ceremony. A guy who's very introverted, had to be strongly encouraged to be presenting like that or that close in with team members, but equally on something like mental health. I thought, I'm pushing my luck here. He very willingly came.
Oh, brilliant.
And actually said in the room as he was doing the intro to this that he had struggled for periods of his life with his own mental health. And that's why he was so committed. And honestly, I nearly burst into tears, which would not have been quite the thing to do at the time. But it really touched me because that I thought, oh my God, in that one moment, and you could see the people's faces in the room, in that one moment, giving of himself like that and making it normal to not be fine, opened up everybody else to feel the same way. And it went round like wildfire in the organisation. It was an amazing moment. I love it when there's moments like that from work. And the fact that I've then remembered it in this moment whilst we're actually talking.
It's interesting you say that because so they came out with, after the study, they came out with 4 main ways to reduce this massive issue of leadership or the lack of well-being and resilience amongst leaders in companies. And the first one was reducing stigma. And so obviously, other leaders modeling that behavior, normalizing conversations about struggling, not being okay, it's okay to not be okay, is a massive, massive first step. What I was super interested in, though, so some of the recommendations they made in companies was, first of all, to investigate a little, to be curious, and we talk about curiosity a lot, was to find out why there was a stigma in this particular organization, because obviously sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it relates to the organization itself, sometimes it's a wider societal thing, and often it is. So sort of to tease out a little bit of the why, because once you know the why, you can start to make changes. Normalizing was the other thing, but the thing that blew my mind, which I think is amazing, and I would love to know if there are organizations that actually do this, was they suggested tying psychological safety to KPIs of the organization.
Love it.
And yeah, I might have to go down a rabbit hole on this one, but
yes.
Yeah, seriously, that's really, really evolved approaches to leadership and management. One of the other issues was strengthening peer relationships, because 59% of leaders found that peer support was helpful for their resilience. I'm surprised it wasn't more, to be honest. But they also found that people who had strong friendships within the organization were 7 times more likely to be more actively engaged in work. So this is all also about the bottom line. It is better for organizations where people's mental health and well-being and resilience are at a higher level.
Yeah. I'm just struck by that KPI around psychological safety and just wondering, because, hands up, did I ever create such a KPI within any of the organisations I was working in? No, I didn't. We definitely looked a lot at engagement scores.
Right.
From an engagement survey perspective. So to your point about where is the engagement at its highest, and so often you'd find it was around engagement with peers, the engagement with the manager. This is why my bread and butter coaching, the bit that I love doing the most, is the middle manager, probably more so than the executive, because the middle manager is so important to get right, to be the brilliant people manager, because they are the people closest in to everybody else, to the organisation. That doesn't let executives and leaders and senior leaders off the hook at being close in, but you have to have it so right with those middle managers. And so those engagement scores were very important, but it's a bit like, when you hear the throwaway line about people don't leave organisations, they leave their manager.
Yeah.
But it's true.
Absolutely.
I'm probably preaching to many of the converted
Hallelujah.
with saying that. But the other thing that would be quite interesting to just explore is psychological safety. I often found with using that in an organisation made it sound quite highbrow.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean? What does it mean to everybody in an organisation?
It's interesting you say that, because I came across another article. In fact, on the course that I'm doing at the moment, one of the students working alongside me, my colleagues, my friends, we've got a WhatsApp group where we share all of these innovation ideas. And she had posted, because we talked about psychological safety a lot, that in order to have creative groups, you have to have psychological safety. And I have some issues about the word psychological safety and what that actually means, and I might go on that a little bit later. But if we go with that concept for the moment, that it was an article from, it must have been Harvard Business Review, about how many leaders fake psychological safety.
Oh.
Yeah, and it was interesting because this idea of psychological safety, and again, I know we had the chat last season with James about difference between boundaries and barriers, that you need to sort of reduce barriers to have teams to properly collaborate, etc. But I still believe that boundaries are really important, because that's about your personal and mental integrity. But it was about the fact that, we all talk about psychological safety. Everyone needs to feel safe, la, 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 la. And, as a leader, you need to be open to be challenged and questioned. And that actually many leaders will say that in a meeting. Oh, yeah, it's okay for you to say you disagree, or what does everyone think? And their body language and their psyche is still not prepared for that. So then they're not being honest.
Yeah.
But even though they're trying, when people say it sounds a bit like it's a dishonest thing, and I don't know that it's a deliberately evil, bad behavior. It just is that it's hard for many people to say, yeah, I'm happy for you to stand there in public and tell me that I'm wrong. Actually, lots of people would be like, I might say that, but I don't feel it. And actually, it's very obvious. I think this study was saying it's really obvious when a leader is not actually embodying this idea that it's okay to disagree with me. It's okay to have different ideas. I am really, really curious about what you think. Because actually, lots of leaders are like, I'm overwhelmed. I've got this deadline. I don't fucking care what you think. Please just do what I say, and let's not drag things out any longer. And I know I've been guilty of that in meetings where you do the blah, 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 blah. This is kind of what we're planning. And then at the very end, before the end of the meeting, that 3 minutes as the meeting's time is supposed to tick down, you go, and does anyone have any disagreement? Anyone got any other ideas? And it's like, no, good, right, let's go. And I think it was this idea of, it's actually this idea of creating psychological safety in terms of being open to challenge, open to new ideas, open to the leader, flattening the hierarchy in a way. It is really challenging for many people. And quite naturally so, because, we have to practice it, I guess, maybe is the thing. And just saying it, tick boxing it, doesn't create psychological safety. So that's why I have I'm a little skeptical sometimes about the idea.
I'm sitting here grinning because, well, I think I don't think I know I've probably been guilty of that in the past, but I'm also sitting here grinning, thinking, "Oh, how do I actually say what I'm about to say and not incriminate anybody else when I'm saying it?" But
change the names.
I guess I've also been on the receiving end of people saying to me, I love this as a statement as well, "I don't want to be surrounded by yes men." And I'm like, okay, well, that gives me a complete out because I'm not, and I won't say yes to everything anyway. And I have put myself at odds with bosses in the past. And I remember one meeting in particular where things were getting pretty scratchy between myself and the boss. We're on screen, so it was being done virtually as well, which didn't help. But I could see the rest of the gang pushing their chairs away from their desks to get away from the conversation.
Yeah.
And then trying to talk to me about it afterwards. I was like, yeah, but none of you, I didn't need rescuing, but I said, none of you rode in.
Yeah.
And I know that some of you agreed. It's interesting to watch that dynamic play out when it's very clear that a person may well have said, I want people's views, etc., etc. And the answer is they don't.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're absolutely right. That is about overwhelm. That is about, we've just got to go and crack on with this. We haven't got time. But you really wish you made the time. And I'm thinking about experiences of that where, because you didn't make time, the bloody wheels fell off.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, there's the other reasons that there are those leaders amongst us, I'm not including us in this, that think that they were always right. And that's when wheels fall off as well, or people leave.
And also, I think there is a pressure with this sort of the patriarchal archetype of the leader who is on a pedestal, who knows everything, is the confident one, is the speaker one, always is the one at the front, takes all of the responsibility and all of the credit. This sort of old style leadership. I think there are many people who still feel, even if they are not that archetype or don't fit in wholly to that archetype, I do think that there is still that sort of pressure on many leaders if you don't sort of look into lots of the other sort of more evolved, advanced styles of leadership that involves, again, my hated word, more soft skills.
Yeah.
To be that person who is always right, who knows, often within a group, and particularly in organizations that are really, really formally hierarchical and are just recruiting the same fit in the box leader style of Western, emotionless, white, older male, as this is what we think a leader should look like. It's really hard for that mindset to change, both for the people in the team and also for the leader, I guess. And so I completely get that all of the studies, endless studies, will say that psychological safety is super important for all kinds of things, all kinds of metrics that are good for organizations, as well as for people's mental health. But it's really difficult to really, truly, honestly create that for many, many people, regardless of whether they are the patriarchal archetype leader. Just generally, it's hard to hear people say, no, you're wrong, or I disagree, or I've got a better idea if you've gone and created something that you think is wonderful. That idea of receiving feedback. There's a woman on our course at the moment who is a writer, and she constantly has to deal with that feedback of, lots of people love her book, but she was talking about how she has to prepare herself for criticism of something that she has invested huge amounts of her soul, I expect, into. And it's hard to hear those words for anyone, no matter how evolved you are, I think that it can be difficult. And obviously context is everything. And so some days you may have the emotional resources to deal with it, and other days you may not. So I do think that I prefer, and this was something that this course in Spain that I went on, they said actually psychological safety is really a bit of a myth, because people are always going to disagree, and people may not feel wholly safe. Safe means I'm not challenged, I'm not feeling uncomfortable. And actually, we have to get used to feeling uncomfortable. And that means we are not necessarily always 100% safe. So they talked instead about spaces that are courageous, so you can speak, and
Yes.
caring. So if you are going to dissent or disagree or say that someone is wrong, that you do so without intentionally trying to hurt them. And I much prefer that, courageous and caring spaces, than creating psychological safety.
It's so true, because I've been sat here listening to what you've been saying, which has been amazing, and also thinking about that meeting that I've just described to you, and taking responsibility that I didn't pick the right moment. I think that speaks to what you're saying, because bringing it up with an audience was not the way to go about it. So that the leader or leaders have a responsibility to ensuring that their bosses are psychologically safe or cared for as well.
Yeah.
So I got that wrong on that day. How I was responded to was equally wrong, but I'll take responsibility for the part that I played in that. And I think that that's the thing that I want to convey, that everyone's responsible for it. And so when we're actually looking at people in organisations, I'd ask that they are as caring and responsible for the safety and the psychological safety and care of their leaders as they expect their leaders to care for them. And I often are working with organisations where you get into this situation of, I'm not going to do it until I see it role modelled from the top.
Yeah.
I know that we want to talk about this in another episode, but I don't think that leaders are just people in a hierarchy or with a particular title. I think that there are leadership aspects to all of us, whatever title we actually hold, which makes us responsible for everybody's well-being. And just because you might not be getting what you think is required from the leadership, why does that stop you not wanting to do the right thing?
Yeah. Well, there's self-leadership too, isn't there, Bobby? I mean, I think that even if you're not, haven't got a title, even if you're not currently in a role or carrying out activities that one might attribute to leadership, there's absolutely still an issue about leading yourself, and all of the things that you've talked about previously in terms of self-regulation, emotional regulation, all of those things. And I love that about this idea of taking responsibility. It's so important.
I am a firm believer, if you do take responsibility for that, you might just get it in return.
Yeah.
If you are constantly waiting to have it first, you might not.
Talking about this idea of leaders supporting each other, so sort of this idea of peer relationships being important, organizations needing to create space for leaders to be able to support each other in a peer way. So the other mind-blowing thing for me in this study was they'd identified that creating peer forums or programs that bring leaders together to collaborate. So they got used to sort of, rather than being in their silos, and I guess often showing another leader at the same level that they need help or asking for help might somehow make them so vulnerable or liable to being stabbed in the back.
Yeah.
But one of the suggestions, and I wonder if you've ever come across this, was to make support of others a performance issue. So something that was part of your evaluation. So KPIs for the organizations and for teams, but actually individual responsibility in terms of how you are assessed at your job, looking at how you support others. And I wondered if you'd ever come across that.
I'm probably back to thinking about values within organisations. And again, this is probably another of my little soapboxes around values, about not having them just slapped on a mouse mat or on a wall and actually meaning something. And so I was always looking for the values in an organisation to be almost like the how you went about achieving your aims, your goals. And so that's where it could be brought in, because often, the values that will have some level of kindness, care, support, whatever it might be. And we also created that sort of like level of EDI, KPI, or target or goal as well, which include the inclusivity piece, which was about supporting each other as well as your own well-being. So I have blended that in. And I think it's often about the how. I remember going back years and years now to one of my first jobs I had after leaving the army. And they wanted to give this guy in the organisation the highest rating you probably could, with 3 grievances out against him from his team. And, I was still learning to how articulate things, in diplomatic
Perish the thought.
ways. So I think it came out with something like that. What the fuck are you thinking? But I said, what are we having here? Do we just just a rating on? But it doesn't matter how many bodies you buried in the back garden or anything. I said, what on earth? So I think that probably that sticks in my mind, because I often used it as the example of, there is no point looking at people's productivity without looking, or performance, or however you want to describe it, without having decent conversations with them about how they've gone about it, how they've brought people with them, how they've been whilst they've been doing that. Which is, and I'm slightly cynical about 360-degree feedback and stuff like that, where people are actually allowed to choose the people that they get to give feedback on, because they only go with the people that they're mates with or like. Whereas I, being the sort of masochist that I am, I would go and choose people that I knew found me difficult.
Yeah.
Or, not that I've fallen out, but, if you want to learn and evolve, it's back to that feedback piece. You've got to be willing to, you're allowed to fall apart, I think, when you get it, and then learn. So I haven't always been good at accepting feedback. I've freaked out about what people said. I've wanted pats on the back the whole time. And I'm still learning to deal with feedback, which is sometimes hard to hear. You are also allowed to have a feeling about the feedback you're getting, but don't go saying it's fine if it's not making you feel fine. You're also allowed to respond with how that's made you feel, and then think about it. The person will have said it for a reason. So I think that there's all of that in it, which is why, the deathly yearly appraisal is not on my Christmas card list.
Mine neither.
Ever. But the regular check-in and how things are going and nipping things in the bud really is. And I think the more I'm just minded that when we started the discussion and you said, I'm feeling a bit low because I've got a cough and a cold, there is a level of how you are feeling health-wise. You didn't say I'm fine, but I still didn't know how you were feeling emotionally.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's not a criticism in any way, shape or form, but I think the I'm fine and what people learn to say in checking in, you almost like evolve the language you want to give around how you're feeling as well. And sometimes it is physical and sometimes it is emotional, and both are okay.
I've got 2 things that have popped into my head from what you've just said. And I'm going with the first one so I don't forget it with my menopause brain. When you've had 360 feedback, were you coached on the feedback? Because when I've had 360 feedback, I think it's been done 2 or 3 times when I've been doing leadership training or other things. There was a coaching element to it so that they talked through the feedback with me. So I could say, I'm really upset about that. because I think it's, well, yeah, I think it's unfair, or I don't know how that person has been able to assess me on that, because I've never met them, or I've never engaged with them. But also, yeah, I take that one, that it makes me feel uncomfortable, but I know that this is something I need to work on, and maybe I'd like to talk with you about what I can do on that. And I found that actually quite helpful
Yes.
to deal with some of the emotional and rational responses I have had to feedback that was not as lovely as I wanted it to be.
Yes, I have had coaching. Thank God, when I've got 360-degree feedback, because again, that evolution of how you feel about it. I remember feeling quite crushed with military reports sometimes, or what they said, because again, it wasn't a 360 from that perspective, but you didn't really get much chance to offer any retort to what had been written on that. So again, that shaping of having to be fine and not responding to anything went from childhood into the military as well. So of course, then when I hop out into the corporate world and start having 360-degree feedback, I was a bit like, right, where are they? I want to speak to them about what they've said. being
Oh
quite
my God.
fighting, being quite fighting. Yeah, being quite fighting about them. How dare you, terribly self-righteous. And thank God for the coach, because they brought me back down off the ceiling to say, well, let's just look at this. How fair is it? What do you think would have had them say that? And you have to then start that period of reflection we keep talking about as well.
Yeah.
Rather than going out and saying you've ruined my credibility, you've got to get better from it. So whilst feedback can sometimes be a quite shitty gift, it's still got to be taken as a gift.
Yeah. And I've completely forgotten what the second thing I was going to ask you about. It's right. What I'm going to do is I will stick it in the blog. I'll do a blog on this episode, and I'll re-listen to and hope that whatever it was that you said that sparked my idea, I'll pop it in there. One thing that we were talking about, and I think that when we're talking about mental health and well-being within organizations, for leaders and for everyone else, which again, I am sort of using this study as sort of the main thrust of my thoughts in this episode.
That's good.
But 21% higher productivity where in organizations where leaders show empathy, and 92% are more likely to stay in their job if they're shown more empathy. So this idea of empathy, kindness, compassion as an organizational culture aim, as well as a very massively important skill in leadership, just really shines through. And again, in terms of the bottom line, in terms of the money that organizations make. And so I found it really interesting where it becomes apparent that organizations that invest, one, in recruiting good leaders, and also having mental health programs within the organization. And I'm not just talking about, we do yoga on the terrace on a Thursday afternoon, really showed that reaps dividends in literally in the long term. But I am interested in what a mental health, I've never been in an organization that has a mental health program, not a real one. The difference between sort of the box ticking elements of mental health programs and the sort of ones that are really juicy, rich. I'm going to keep sticking the word rich into the episodes at the moment, just because it makes me laugh. But what's your experience? Have you seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in your time in HR?
Yeah, I think I have. And I completely agree that what you actually want is a blend of the empathy DNA flowing through everything that actually happens on a day-to-day basis. But what I'm going to say is that I think you can tell a lot about an organization when they're dealing with somebody who's grieving.
Yeah.
And so I have been in those organizations where they want you to stick to the policy of compassionate leave. It's 3 days. Your parents just died and you are expected to be back tickety-boo in 3 days. What the absolute hell?
Wow.
And again, I remember being in an organisation where one of my managers had lost her mother and was not going to be right in a very short space of time. So I took it upon myself to say, you come back when you're ready. And again, I got a lot of stick for this from my boss. And this was very early doors after I just left the military. And again, I had been through the loss of a parent at that point, and I had chosen to go straight back to work,
Yeah.
but it all takes us differently. And the difference I got as a result of letting this manager do what she needed to do and come back when she was ready, I firmly believe paid dividends.
Yeah, of course.
So there's the extreme of an organisation that sticks the whole policy shenanigans in place and wants to stick to it. And I know that we can't do this, but policies are something that I have taken great delight in getting rid of a lot of the time, because I think when it comes to the grieving process, it's got to be at manager's discretion, which is why we are back to needing great managers to say to somebody, what do you need?
Yeah.
What do you need? So if I then extrapolate that out, I go looking for organisations. I like to work with organisations who are willing to have those open conversations about what do you need on a daily basis. One of the things we put into one of the organisations that I've worked with, and this came from, I can't remember where it came from, but I thought it was such a brilliant idea that I nicked it. So whoever it was, thank you very much. But we used to have a WRAP, which was a wellbeing recovery action plan. And so you had that, and during the induction, it would be, when you're having a day of overwhelm, what do you need? Is it a duvet day? Is it a walk round? Is it a walk round the block? Is it somebody to talk to? What's your favourite chocolate? Just things that seem sort of like a bit silly, but are really important, because that gave the first opening to, this organisation might just care a little bit if I'm having a bad day.
Yeah. Like, that's amazing.
And it started the openness. But with any of these things, for anything to work and not be a tick box, you have to get up with the commitment to it being important in your organisation every day. We're back to that. It's the little things. What did I say? BSQ. Think big, act small, move quickly.
Nice one.
That's what the Wellbeing Recovery Action Plan could do. But what it is it's part and parcel of that overall feeling of, what do you need? Who do you need to talk to? And people being accessible to all of that. So I have seen little feelers of great things where it matters, and it doesn't need to be extraordinarily ambitious, but it doesn't need to sit behind a frigging policy to say that someone's going to get over the death of a loved one within 3 days and be back to performing well in your organisation.
And this organisation that you're talking about, so it brings me to the final recommendation in the report, which was rethink work. And so a lot of the themes that you're talking about are reflected in that. The recommendation was that managers have freedom to prioritise how work is done. A big piece was managing workload and powering people, but particularly leaders, to be able to disconnect. But this big issue of having the flexibility in how they manage their team's time and work priorities. And that would obviously, once a leader has that empowerment, then they are freer to be able to be flexible when someone has an urgent need to not be at work. They even recommended, for leaders particularly, being able to take leave and sabbaticals just so that they can refresh without worrying about, where they're going to be when they come back to work. The other thing that made me laugh was meetings. I know that it's a bugbear of both of ours, but again, big recommendation was that, meetings are reduced and that all the sort of admin bollocks is automated. I think there's a big space for AI to take off a whole load of the pressure from leaders in a whole load of the bollocks bureaucracy that organisations seem to get involved in.
Yeah. Any organisation needs to start with what they think. It's like the low-hanging fruit, business jargon, but those bits that they think that they can deal with really quickly, like the reduction of meetings or something like that, because it was a massive challenge and very ambitious every time I wanted to do that with that fluidity and flexibility that you wanted managers to have. Because, of course, what the organisation would do would freak out with the lack of framework or parameters around it. And I'm like, no, of course there's got to be parameters and frameworks, but we don't have to be as restrictive as your policies are saying. So all of my HR colleagues out there, please start thinking about the things that are written down in there and check out whether they're really human or not. And I do understand that actually putting those things in place needs to be for mature organisations, but we're never going to make mature organisations if we keep hiding behind policy, or we don't change the little things that we can get a grip on quickly. So those recommendations, an organisation can decide just to do one and then watch the ripple effect.
And we're all about the ripple effect, aren't we, Bobby?
We are about the ripple effect, the little pebbles making big pond movements.
And we're kind of coming up to the end of this episode, but just one thing that I had to say, because I found this, I guess it's a psychology experiment or something like that. It's an academic document, and it's about, I think it's about kindness, but it's called pro-social behavior. So I'm going to be using that word from now on instead of kindness, pro-social behavior.
Oh,
which just sounds kind of cuddly and warm, whereas pro-social behavior sounds weird. But anyway, they did a whole load of experiments on pro-social behavior and what impact it had in the workplace. And they found that people who were on the receiving end of pro-social behavior, they benefited in the short term because their work improved, but they became happier, which is understandable. But the people who were tasked with being pro-social, doing the pro-social behaviors, reported being less depressed and more satisfied with their lives and their jobs.
yes.
So being kind or pro-social, as I will be forever using that, I'm not going to be using that word.
Oh, God.
Being kind actually is good for your mental health.
Yes, absolutely. I shall put this link in as well. I follow a blog, sort of like link, Random Acts of Kindness.
Oh, yeah.
They say something very similar. So the more you do, the more you get back and the better you feel. It's the whole emotional effect.
So be kind, people.
Yes, be kind. And on that note, I have 2 tiny quotes.
Yay!
To support all of us who are too quick to say, I'm fine, when asked how we are. They're both anonymous, I'm afraid, but check these out and maybe have a think about this for the rest of the day. Here's the first one. The emotion that can break your heart is sometimes the very one that heals it. The emotion that can break your heart is sometimes the very one that heals it. So there's a good reason for articulating what it is that you might be feeling. And then the second one is, in order to move on, you must understand why you felt what you did and why you no longer need to feel it. In order to move on, you must understand why you felt what you did and why you no longer need to feel it.
Lovely. Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks, Bridge. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. It's time to talk day on Thursday, the 1st of Feb. So we'd love to hear any suggestions or experiences you have. As always, the resources are on our website and on the Spotify podcast page. Next month, because it is the month of love, we're moving on to themes around the heart, starting with authentic communication and being a heart speaker. See you then.